Hi, I'm Bob Schoolcraft, pastor at Friendship United Methodist Church, Punta Gorda, Florida. I'd like to welcome you on this 7th day of March, 2021. My scripture selection this morning comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26. Now, some of you are old enough to remember that back in the 70s, mood rings were a big fad, sort of like a pet rock. They were especially popular with young girls. The theory behind the mood ring was that the body heat fluctuates with the emotional state of the wearer, and the ring was attuned to the body's temperature. And none of this was ever established scientifically, of course, but like most fads, it provided some fun for people, especially for comedians and cartoonists. For example, in 1976, a Peanuts comic strip, and everyone knows I love Charlie Brown and Peanuts and Snoopy, but Peppermint Patty gets so angry at Charlie Brown, her mood ring explodes. Now, that's a bad mood, okay? My favorite example of a mood ring, however, comes and concerns a woman who reported that her husband was unhappy with her mood swings. So he bought her a mood ring, and he hoped that he would be able to monitor her moods and prepare himself accordingly. And it worked. He discovered that when she was in a good mood, the ring turned green. When she was in a bad mood, the ring left a big red mark on his forehead. Maybe the next time he said, I'll buy her a diamond. Everybody gets in a bad mood at one time or another. And some of those moods, however, if not controlled, could lead to some very, very bad things. Timothy McVeigh, in explaining why he bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, said he was angry with the government and the way they handled the Branch Davidian crisis in Waco, Texas. Blame game. He blamed the government. He was so angry that he blew up a government building and killed over 100 innocent men, women, and children. All of us, at some time or another, experience anger, resentment, and hostility and rage. And thankfully, most handle it better than Timothy McVeigh. For some of us, however, anger is a big issue in our lives. It causes us to lash out at our spouses, our children. We unleash it on others on the road or in the workplace. We make ourselves and those around us miserable, often harming them, killing them. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, confronts the subject of anger head on. You have heard it said long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, an Aramaic term of contempt, something like numbskull today, is answerable to court. And anyone says, you fool, will be in danger of the fires of hell. Why would Jesus make these extreme comments about an emotion as universal as anger? It's because the outward act always begins with an inward emotion. I believe we need to give these words of our Master our most prayerful consideration, particularly in this day of urban bombings and school massacres and road rage. It appears to me that a number of people, teenagers and adults, are walking around like ticking time bombs. The pervasiveness of anger in our society is reaching appalling proportions. You can't have a civilized conversation with some people without them exploding in an ugly passion on one subject or another. It's scary today. Obviously, only a few of these people will ever erupt into such a fury that they kill somebody, but the potential is always there. So we need to take Jesus seriously when he says the heart of the problem is the human heart itself. If we are filled with anger and hate, we are all potentially murderers. I want you to know that. Anger is destructive to others and to ourselves. We know how destructive anger can be. We may not be conscious of how destructive it can be to ourselves, though. Dr. Redford B. Williams, Jr. of Duke University reported several years ago that anger or hostility is harmful to our bodies, particularly to our hearts, as smoking as high blood pressure it can be. At an American Heart Association seminar, Williams described research on hostility as measured by the widely used Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. A study involved 255 physicians who took this test on as medical students, and over the next 25 years, those with hostility scores in the upper 50% experienced a death rate of more than 14%. Those who scored below 50 on the hostility had only a death rate of 2.5%. Heart disease was 5 times more common among those with the hostile group. And we're told that a rattlesnake, if cornered, will bite itself. Anger and resentment are like that. They are destructive not only to others but to ourselves. So we ask, how do we deal with anger in a constructive way? What are some guidelines? Now, in the first place, we need to see that there are times when people ought to express their anger. And that is something that a lot of good, sweet, nice, decent people need to realize. It's okay to express your anger. When Jesus told us to turn the other cheek, he did not mean for us to become doormats for everyone to walk on. Certainly, Jesus was no doormat. Remember how he threw the tax collectors out of the temple? He was angry with those who criticized him for healing on the Sabbath. In Mark 3:5, he even uses the word anger. And in Matthew 23:17, he called the Pharisees blind fools. So we conclude that there is a place for anger. We are wrong if we take these words to mean that all anger is a sin. Paul tells us, be angry and do not sin. Ephesians 4:26. There are times when expressing our anger is the proper thing to do. There's an old story of a Swami at a village temple in Bengal who claimed to have mastered anger. And when his ability to control anger was challenged, he told the story of a cobra who used to sit on the path by where everyone walked and bite people on their way to the temple. The Swami went to visit with the snake to end the problem. And using a mantra, he called the snake to him and brought it into submission. Telling the snake that it was wrong to bite people, the Swami persuaded it to promise never to do that again. And when the people saw that the snake was now made no attempt to bite them, they grew unafraid. Unfortunately, before long, the village boys were tormenting that poor snake. They knew it wouldn't bite him. They were dragging it through the village, and later the Swami again visited that snake to see if he had kept his promise. He found the snake miserable and hurting. And the Swami, on seeing this, explained, "You are bleeding. Tell me how this come to be." And the snake was in anguish, and he blurted out that he had been abused ever since the Swami had made him promise to quit biting people. To which the Swami said, "I told you not to bite, but I did not tell you not to hiss." We need to know that it's all right to hiss when we're being abused or taken advantage of. It's all right. We need to express our anger in the face of evil. Remember that even anger is a gift from God. It can be a great motivating force in life. Martin Luther once said, "When I am angry, I can pray well and I can preach well." And I can too, I guarantee you. Men and motor cars, Channing Pollock said that, men and motor cars progress by a series of internal explosions. Anger is only our enemy when we let it get out of control, or worse, when it controls us, or when it's linked to a specific group of people. But the first guideline is this: there are times when anger needs to be expressed. And there's a second guideline that's equally important. It's this: anger needs to be resolved at the first possible opportunity. Immediately after speaking these harsh judgments concerning anger, Jesus says, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar, go find them and be reconciled to them, then come back to offer your gift." In other words, he's telling us anger needs to be resolved at the first possible opportunity. Anger is most destructive when it's allowed to lie dormant and for a long time and fester like an infected wound. That's one of the biggest problems in marriage today is persons will just hold it inward and hold it inward and hold it inward, and all of a sudden they explode at the least possible thing. It's not the major things that it's the little things that build up and build up and build up, and the resentment just explodes, just comes out right then. Now, in his book, The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis tells us the story of a visitor who is permitted to be a temporary guest in hell. At one point, the visitor accompanies a busload of souls from hell who are allowed to visit heaven. And while in heaven, these residents of hell each have the privilege of staying in heaven if they so choose. Surprisingly, many do not choose to do so. The book considers these stories of the passengers, and it tells about them and telling why they would rather not stay in heaven. And one of these is of a woman whose husband has treated her shabbily on earth, and she decides to return to hell. And the reason she gives is she would rather burn in hell than forgive him for what he had done. I've seen people with that kind of anger and that resentment within them, and the results are often tragic. Some time ago, I heard about two unmarried sisters who inherited the old family homestead when their parents died. They lived together in peace for several years, but one day they had a disagreement, and it was so heated that they refused to speak to each other. But even this did not satisfy them. They decided to build a dividing wall right through that house, right through the house. And each sister had her own separate bedrooms, and that was great. They were there. But the living room, the dining room, the kitchen were divided by half a wall. And this created something of a problem, and a big problem at that. And but it was a serious inconvenience, The kitchen, one side had the stove, the other didn't. It had the water. The one with the stove went with her neighbors, went to her neighbors to get water. And the one with the water, used a little charcoal burner to heat her food on. And then one day tragedy struck. And one of the sisters had a stroke that left her paralyzed and speechless. She had no way of summoning help from her sister, who was only a few feet away on the other side of the wall. In a few hours, she died. The living sister, realizing that her stubbornness had contributed to her sister's death, was so guilt-ridden that she died within a few weeks also. Tragedy so often results from unresolved anger and resentment. Remember the old adage, never let the sun set on your anger. It's a good principle for everyone concerned. It's good for your marriage, your family, your heart, your health, your business, and your relationships. Raymond McHenry tells about a scene in the Academy Award-winning movie Forrest Gump that's worth pondering. I love Forrest Gump, one of my favorite movies. Forrest Gump, of course, was a super successful movie that has been viewed by millions and millions of Americans. And most people remember the line, "Life is like a box of chocolates." But there's another line, says McHenry and myself, that's worth noting. This particular scene has one of the central characters, Jenny, returning to her old home after her father had died. The old farmhouse is dilapidated and abandoned, and as she reflects on the sexual abuse she had endured as a child, she is so overcome by rage, and she begins picking up rocks and hurling them at the house. You can see the anger as she throws them that way, violently throwing them, and generally finally falls to the ground in exhaustion. And the scene closes with Forrest Gump sympathizing and saying, "Sometimes there just aren't enough rocks." And that's true. No matter what anyone has done to you, sometimes there just aren't enough rocks. And that's when we need to surrender our anger, surrender our hatred to God, and allow Him to replace these negative emotions with love and forgiveness. And this brings us to our final guideline for today. Unresolved anger is a spiritual problem. Anger not only affects our health and our relationship with others, it is important in our relationship with God. That's why Christ tells us that if we are offering our gift at the altar and there remember our brother or sister has something against us, We are to leave our gift and go and be reconciled with them and then come and offer our gift. A heart full of anger is a spiritual impediment. Some of you may remember that day in 1981 when millions of people all over the world watched as Pope John Paul II was shot by the Turkish terrorist named Mehmet Ali Agha. And Agha was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. How did the Pope deal with his feelings of anger toward this terrorist? He dealt with them like a Christian. On Christmas of 1983, the Pope met with Agha in prison, in his prison cell, to extend forgiveness and reconciliation. Did it make a difference? A year later, Agha made a proclamation from his prison cell that he was renouncing terrorism to become a man of peace. He promised that if he was ever freed, he would become, quote, a preacher, going to all nations of the world, preaching love and truth to all nations. You have to wonder what would happen in this world if all Christians followed Pope John Paul's example. What do you do with anger? There's a simple book that has become very popular worldwide, and it's titled The Law of the Garbage Truck: How to Respond to People Who Dump on You. David Pauly, a keynote speaker, a psychologist, narrowly escaped a life-threatening automobile accident when a car, without warning, plowed into the taxi that he was riding. And the driver of the other car, who was definitely at fault, shouted obscenities at the driver, gave him the one-finger salute, but however, the taxi driver just simply smiled and waved at him politely, wished him well. Mr. Pauly was impressed and asked why he had done that. And the taxi driver explained, well, many people are like garbage trucks. They run around full of garbage, full of frustration, full of anger, full of disappointment. As their garbage piles up, they look for a place to dump it. And if you let them, they'll dump it on you. So when someone wants to dump on you, don't take it personally. Just smile and wish them well and move on. And believe me, you'll be happier. And in his book, Mr. Pauly says, what about you? What would happen in your life starting today if you let more garbage trucks pass by? Here's my bet. You're going to be a lot happier. You'd be happier. The world would be a better place. Learn to control your anger. Learn to forgive those who've done you wrong. And when you are in a mood to kill, either literally or figuratively, pause for a moment and remember Christ's teaching. Turn your anger over to him and walk away with a smile on your face. Always a smile on your face and God in your heart. And I promise you, you're going to have a happy, rewarding, productive life. Amen.